Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to inaugurate this webinar, which is to note and celebrate the award to Dr. Annette Idler of the Vice-Chancellor's Innovation Award, the Early Career category at the University of Oxford. Dr. Idler is the director of the Oxford University Changing Character of War Centre, and she's the Senior Research Fellow at Pembroke College and at the Department of International Relations at the University of Oxford. She's also a visiting fellow at the Weatherhead Center in Harvard, and her work covers the interface between conflict, security, and transnational organized crime. A particular achievement in relation to this award is the CONPEACE project, which she has directed for a number of years now, and which focuses on the extremely important and difficult question of the transition from war to peace in Colombia. And she has a book which has received a number of awards on that subject called Borderlands Battles. And she also has coming out shortly a further book on the war on drugs. It's an extreme pleasure to me to pass the word now to the Nobel Prize winner, Peace Prize winner, and former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who is going to make the initial presentation.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to you. Good morning to all of the people who are seeing this that is in this side of the continent, because we are here in the morning. And I am very honored to replace the Vice-Chancellor in this event. She's a remarkable woman. And I'm even more honored, and I want to congratulate Dr. Annette Idler for winning the University of Oxford's Vice-Chancellor Innovation Award in one of the categories, the early career category, for something that is needed all around the world, innovation. And it's rethinking conflict and building peace. She was also highly commended in the inspiring leadership category for her research, which has inspired new understanding of armed conflict and also helped to peace building. Dr. Idler's leads an interdisciplinary group of 18 people that brings together the ethnographic fieldwork with the quantitative analysis, with the complexity science, with the visualization techniques, visual arts, and also historical tracing to provide something which in this pandemic has flourished very much because of its importance, evidence-based guidance on the directions and pace of change in conflict. As was just said, she also leads the international recognized research program CONPEACE, from conflict actors to architects of peace. And let me say, this is a very, very important subject. And in this program, she innovates peace building efforts in Colombia and also around the world. Her work, and I've been very much familiarized with her work, focuses on the interface of conflict, security, and transnational organized crime. Again, in Colombia, this is very evident. And she has conducted extensive field work in and on crisis-affected regions here in my country and Colombia and Venezuela, Colombia and Ecuador, but also in other regions of the world like Myanmar and Somalia. So with great pleasure, I give the floor to Dr. Idler.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to the University of Oxford for the award. I'm very honored to be receiving it. This research has been a group effort. So first of all, I would like to thank my colleagues at CCW and especially my teams involved in the Conflict Platform project and the CONPEACE program for their hard work. Also, this research would not have been possible without the brilliant support of a number of funders, especially UK research councils, the Global Challenges Research Fund, the Fritz Thyssen Foundation, the Oxford Berlin seed funding, and the British, the Canadian, and the Colombian governments. I'd also like to thank DPIR, Pembroke College, and Harvard's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, which has been hosting me as a visiting scholar. Let me now tell you what Rethinking Conflict, Building Peace is about. This research emerges from my work on Colombia's borderlands, published by Oxford University Press as the book Borderland Battles. I spent a decade studying the conflict, including extended fieldwork in the country's conflict-affected border areas. Through that research, 3 points about the armed conflict became clear. First, its transnationality. Colombia's conflict has been evolving across national boundaries. I found that much of the conflict dynamics continued on the other side of Colombia's borders, on Venezuelan and Ecuadorian territory. Second, the relevance of many different armed groups involved and their dynamic interactions. Even though the most well-known group involved in the conflict is the FARC, numerous other armed actors played a role too. Changes in their interactions, whether they fight or cooperate with each other, also changed the security situation for people on the ground. And third, the interconnectedness. Changes in conflict dynamics are often driven by resources, in particular by the logic of illicit flows. And this logic is determined by how conflict actors in Colombia connect with others, such as Mexican cartels or traffickers in West Africa in the global cocaine supply chain. What I observed in South America characterizes armed conflict today across the world. Broadly speaking, there are 3 trends, and these trends are why we need to rethink conflict in order to build peace. First, armed conflicts are increasingly transnational. As you can see in this graph, they're hardly confined to one single state. Conflict-affected areas include Syria and Iraq, several countries in the African Great Lakes region, or the border area shared by Afghanistan and Pakistan, all regions we work on. Second, non-state groups active in violent conflict are proliferating. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, more armed groups have formed in the past decade than in the past 6 decades together. This means that alliances and front lines can change very quickly. Third, contemporary conflicts are increasingly interconnected. Globalization has expanded communication technologies and infrastructures and increased the speed at which information can be shared internationally. Groups can find recruits via social media, such as Facebook and Twitter. These technologies also facilitate dynamic links between groups. For example, organized criminals subcontracting computer hackers, terrorists engaging in spot sales with arms traffickers, or human smugglers working together with militias. Now, why does all of this matter? Protecting civilians exposed to constantly changing conflict dynamics is not easy, and stopping such conflicts is arguably even harder. Most responses still follow the logic of country strategies, even though conflicts spill across borders. Conflict actors often change alliances so quickly that the international community lags behind with responses, which has led to the unintentional backing of enemies in places such as Syria. And the enhanced interconnectivity of armed groups has made them more resilient, their operations more ambiguous, and the location of attacks more unpredictable. Against this backdrop, we argue that it is necessary to rethink conflict by asking, how does armed conflict change dynamically, and what are the consequences for people-centered security? Linked to this, and given that peace agreements typically remove some, but not necessarily all armed actors from the picture, we address the following question with a view to enhancing peace building. What are the implications of transitions from war to peace and the changes on the ground in conflict zones that come with them for security architectures? On this, I would like to point out that we have a holistic take on armed conflict, broadly defined as lethal intergroup violence. We conceptualize security as people-centered. That is, the referent object of security includes humans, not only states. And we consider a wide range of actors that operate in conflict settings, including rebels, paramilitaries, but also others such as gangs or drug cartels. Despite the significance of changes in conflicts for understanding current global security threats, such changes are only partially captured by existing approaches to studying armed conflict. At the macro level, scholars have identified trends of violence and changes in the overall character of war. At the micro level, there's a huge body of literature on conflict onset, duration, and interventions to end conflict, and work on the complexity of conflict. On transitions from war to peace, some scholars have pointed to the partial nature of transitions, with grievances remaining unaddressed, and to the need to build a stable peace. Overall, however, there's little work that integrates these different strands into a holistic approach that allows making sense of change, not just in terms of how it is observed externally, but also how it is experienced and perceived subjectively through the eyes or analytical lenses of very different types of researchers or stakeholders. This is exactly what we are hoping to do with our work. We therefore have a research innovation strategy with 4 steps. First, in the process of doing research, we connect unusual interlocutors, including research approaches and perspectives. Second, we take our academic outputs, such as journal articles, to another level and think through how they can become tools for others to make the most out of our research. Third, we include others in the crucial step of applying the research to identify solutions, so that in the 4th step, our findings can be used and insights replicated across other contexts independently. Of course, in practice, this process is much messier and probably looks a bit more like this, but the general direction is the same. Let me explain how we do this in practice. In order to understand dynamic change in armed conflict and how it affects people's security, I've set up the Conflict Platform project together with my co-investigators, Professor Peter Wilson and Dr. Robert Johnson. The platform connects unusual interlocutors in that it promotes dialogue across different epistemologies, methodologies, and disciplines. For example, we bring together ethnographic fieldwork with quantitative analysis, complexity science, visualization techniques, visual arts, and historical tracing back to the 30 Years' War. Applying these different approaches, we study specific aspects of change in conflict in 10 focal cases across the world and additional cases across history. This allows us to better understand the different facets of change and their repercussions on people. Let me give you 3 examples. The first example concerns visual arts, in particular, the use of photo essays. We have been working with photographers to capture local perceptions of changing conflict dynamics. Take the case of Mexico, included on our website, as you can see here. Seen through the lens of the photographer, Javier Manzano, the occurrences on the ground resemble war scenes. The images capture both the horror and normalization of violence in a context that is not formally a war, but otherwise indistinguishable from one. Understanding such perceptions sheds light on security dynamics that often stay outside conventional conflict research, just because the case is not labeled as an armed conflict. The second example is how quantitative analysis and visualization techniques help us make sense of complexity as inherent in changes in conflict, including changing actor constellations. In the case of northern Nigeria, for example, visualization techniques allow us to show how the conflict between the government and Boko Haram needs to be understood in the context of many other actors involved, including neighboring countries. We make visualization an integral element of the research process because it activates different cognitive pathways that permit to analyze complex forms. In other words, the human brain is used to identifying visual patterns, so drawing on this human capacity helps us understand complex phenomena such as changing conflict dynamics. Third, I'd like to highlight how ethnographic methods help us understand people's experiences of changing conflict. Through my own fieldwork in remote border areas of Myanmar earlier this year, I learned how local communities experience changes in the conflict situation, for example, from ongoing conflict to a ceasefire. To them, this increased uncertainty and hence undermined their felt security because it destabilized the previously existing order. In the current pandemic, many of us have experienced how uncertainty about what might happen next can fuel negative thoughts and influences people's behavior. Think of the toilet paper panic buying. Now imagine people immersed into conflict dynamics where such uncertainty is often linked to survival, and it gives you an idea of the relevance of change for their daily lives. This brings me to the second step of identifying creative tools to make our research findings useful more broadly. We have made our visualizations interactive, so that, for example, practitioners working on the Horn of Africa can pick the type of visualization and time period that is most of interest to them, to see, for instance, how conflict events shift from Ethiopia and Somalia to Kenya. This is based on the methodology we developed to identify what we call settings of organized violence that are not confined to state boundaries. The third step is co-creating solutions. This is why we work together with New America and the United Nations System Staff College. We have co-developed courses with UNSSC. There's another one upcoming soon. These courses integrate these visualizations and a dynamic changing character of conflict tool that allows practitioners to trace those changes rather than to analyze conflict as a static phenomenon. Finally, in a last step, we make these techniques available to others across the world to allow multiple perspectives to engage in the interpretation of results. For example, here we see how, when adjusting the time period to the late 2000s, the conflict in Colombia became most intense in the border areas. This may be a story of success for users from the center, but the interpretation might be a very different one for a borderlander. Our approach thus is a way of embracing multiple narratives and a more pluralistic view on how dynamic conflict takes shape and affects civilians than would be possible by only creating written outputs from a single perspective. This brings me to the second part, transitions from war to peace. With CONPEACE, we focus specifically on Colombia, the case we've just seen, to understand the implications of changes on the ground that occur during transitions to help build sustainable peace. So again, we bring together unusual interlocutors, for example, by contrasting perspectives from the state center with perspectives from the margins. The graph we saw before showed events until 2017, when the FARC, Colombia's largest rebel group, demobilized after they signed a historic peace deal with the Colombian government. I visited local border communities close to the demobilization camps shortly afterwards to understand how they experienced and perceived this change. There, a farmer said to me, "We are concerned that this peace may become another battlefield." After the FARC had left, many other armed actors tried to fill this power vacuum, and from the locals' perspective, this was even more worrisome than the situation before. That's why at CONPEACE, we argue that such transitions need to be understood as changing security landscapes that vary across the territory rather than linear processes from war to peace. Across the team, we also bring in additional perspectives on and experiences of these changes. For example, we demonstrate how people are affected by the removal of rules of behavior once the dominant actor leaves, why the changing security landscape is gendered, with women being particularly severely affected by some aspects of it, and also most recently, how COVID-19 adds additional pressure on conflict-affected areas. So again, as a second step, we identify creative tools through which our findings can be applied. Security needs in the margins can look very different to what they may look like for policymakers in the center. That's why we've produced policy briefs, and we also collected best practices for civil society organizations based in marginalized regions. In a third step, we co-create solutions with unusual interlocutors to find a way to build sustainable peace. We do this through our cross-stakeholder methodology that brings together civil society representatives from marginalized regions, government, academia, and the international community, including our partner, the UN Refugee Agency. Through this methodology, we share and further refine conceptual and analytical tools, such as the border effect, and foster mutual understanding of diverging visions of security needs and responses. This has helped, for example, reduce mistrust among these stakeholders. It has also helped achieve the fourth step, sparking different thinking. Stakeholders, for example, themselves encouraged others to think locally, that is, to account for people's perceptions at the very local level, to understand constraints and opportunities attached to security architectures at the national level, and to put this into the international context to generate more insights. To sum up, In our research on changing conflict dynamics and transitions from war to peace, we found that we get best results both to push the boundaries of knowledge on war and peace and to contribute to mitigating human suffering in 4 ways. First, by innovating the research process, that is, by linking perceptions, experiences, and complexity in conflict, and bridging the central-periphery gap for shared understandings of peace. Second, by innovating outputs. This includes, for example, creating interactive visualizations of dynamic change and gathering best practices on security responses. Third, by using our findings to solve problems together, as is reflected now in the UN training curriculum and as we do through our cross-stakeholder forums. And fourth, by opening up our work to and spark different thinking in others, which has led others to multiply our findings and to replicate our methodology. Of course, there's a lot more to do. That's why we are grateful for the huge support we have received so far and are also looking for further support to expand our data collection and research, including to other conflict and transition cases. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annette. That gives us a very clear overview of the richness of the CONPEACE project and also of its substantial policy importance. So I now turn to President Santos, architect of the peace process, to give us his thoughts and reactions.
Thank you, and again, congratulations, Annette. And I would like for the next few minutes to address the students and the early career researchers to tell you how important your work is, because you're going to save many lives and a lot of human suffering. And I want to refer your work to my case. Colombia had the longest war with the strongest and oldest guerrilla in the Western Hemisphere for over 50 years, and everybody thought it was impossible to reach peace, to have a peace agreement. And we tried many times, my predecessors tried many times to no avail. Why did we have success? Precisely because we made a lot of research before starting the peace process. We studied very closely the different efforts in my country to make peace with the FARC, and we studied many peace processes around the world, ones that were successful and the ones that were not. And we tried to extract what would be applicable to our case. We did that, and that helped us tremendously. And we also had to innovate. For example, the peace agreement in Colombia was the first one to put the victims of the conflict at the center of the negotiations. That was a very useful innovation because we negotiated around the rights of the victims, their rights to justice, their rights to the truth, which is very important, their rights to reparations and to non-repetition. And we successfully negotiated after more than 4.5 years, and then the second phase started. As you know, every peace process has 2 phases, peacemaking and peace building. Peacemaking is very difficult, but peace building is much more difficult. And I want to simply mention a short anecdote with the Pope. I went many times during the peacemaking phase to visit the Pope. We became friends, and I said, why don't you go to Colombia and give me a push? This is very difficult. You can help me. And he said, don't worry, I pray for you a lot, but I will go when you will, and the Colombians will most need me. And he came to Colombia after we had signed the peace agreement. And he put a name to his visit. I'm going to push the Colombians to take the first step towards reconciliation, which is the most difficult part of a peace process. And I wish I had much more research, much more examples of failures and successes about this phase, the peace-making phase, the peace, the peace building phase, because we have had a lot of problems with this phase. And so the research that you can make on this is invaluable. Every conflict has its own characteristics, its own conditions, and you must be very aware of that. But you can use examples from one conflict to the other when it is applicable. In the case of Colombia, and Annette knows this very well, we had an arrow, a poisonous arrow transversal to all the violence in Colombia, which is drug trafficking. And drug trafficking financed the guerrilla movements, financed the organized crimes. They are very much interrelated. And one of the consequences of the peace agreement has been that the organized crime had been trying to replace the FARC in the control of the territory that was controlled before by the FARC, the organized crime, because they want to continue their business. And we have had many problems with something which is essential in any peace building process and in any reconciliation, is to heal the wounds. And there, the truth has become a very, very important component of this reconciliation. I remember a professor that came to me at the beginning of the process, said, this is going to be very difficult for you. You are going to lose your political capital, or you're going to be called a traitor, as I've been called, but talk to the victims. And I started to talk to the victims, and he said to re-energize you to continue. And that's what I did. And in this conversation with the victims, I was impressed by two things. First, their willingness to be generous. I thought the victims would be less willing to be generous in terms of, for example, transitional justice. But the second thing that I was not so much aware of is that many of them said to me, I don't want to reparations. My daughter or my son has no price. What I want to know is why they did that, or where is my son, or where is my daughter? I want the truth. And this is something that we right now are discussing, because the truth is necessary to heal, but many people are afraid of the truth. And this is something that would be of great importance to have more research on. How can you manage the processes for the truth to come out, but at the same time that truth doesn't reignite a conflict or reignite these negative sentiments, but on the contrary, you can sort of use the truth to really reconcile. There are many, many aspects that need a lot of research. In Colombia, we are also innovating as we go along, because this peace process has many sui generis, many very innovative components. This is a peace process, probably the most comprehensive and most ambitious peace process ever signed. We have 15 years, because we didn't only sign what they call the DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of the armed groups into society. We went much further. But that also creates many problems. And the relation between the different parties within the country, the relation with the international community, how we have to adapt to changing situations. conflicts change, situations change, and you have to be able to have the capacity to adapt to those changes. And their research evidence is extremely, extremely useful. So you are in a field that is very important for the future of mankind. Conflict, unfortunately, will always be present. Conflict evolves, and you must be aware of how it evolves and how it changes in order to cope with it and to try to solve conflict. And that is like in democracies have to be always overhauled, always adapted to the new circumstances. So does conflict resolution and peace building. Therefore, I encourage you to continue in this area. This is of great importance, and I thank you for the work you do. And again, Annette, my congratulations, because I know the work you've done in my country and in other countries is invaluable. I congratulate you for that and for the very, very important award that you are getting.
Annette, do you have any thoughts, reactions to that?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the University of Oxford, the Vice-Chancellor, for the award. I'd like to thank you, Professor Lawrence Whitehead, for moderating the event. And I'd particularly like to thank Nobel Peace Prize laureate Juan Manuel Santos for being with us here. It's a great honor to have you there. And as Lawrence said, you are the architect of the peace. So I think that's really important to consider. And I also agree with what you said about peace building. Signing peace is the first step. And I think what we can learn from Colombia also for other cases really is that the efforts need to continue. And what we've seen in our work is that once the peace deal has been signed, there is a reshuffling, reconstellation of the many actors on the ground, of the evolving security landscape, the way we call it. And that is exactly why we need to continue those efforts afterwards.
Thank you very much. We have some questions for the discussion now. I'm going to start with a couple for you, Annette, and then I have a question I'd like to put to President Santos, if I may. So first of all, what part of the research that you've done are you most proud of?
Well, I think to me, what was really important was what I also mentioned in the presentation, to connect different interlocutors in probably unusual ways. And that, first of all, especially in the case of the conflict platform work that I've been doing, to connect the different disciplinary lenses that we've used. And many of us know who worked in academia that every discipline has their own language. Sometimes it's challenging to create a common understanding, but it's also extremely fulfilling and I think intellectually stimulating to learn from each other. And just to give some examples, I mean, thanks to bringing in history, for example, we were able to identify patterns of how conflict actors shift alliances across history. That is not just the case right now. Or another example is the connection between arts and social sciences that we do. And I think social, or the way that we look at arts as a non-verbal means of expression is particularly important when we try to understand local communities affected by conflict, for whom, for example, written language means much less than to others. So combining those different approaches, I think was really useful. And that then also with regard to how we worked in practice together with stakeholders. I explained about the cross-stakeholder forums where we bring together academia, government, the international community, and civil society. And that has been very powerful to see, for example, encounters between an indigenous human rights defender from a marginalized border region who might have been harassed by members of the state forces, but also on the other hand, with a member of the state forces who has lost comrades on the battlefield. And what we've seen was that at the beginning of the conference, of the forum, there was skepticism towards the other side. There was a lack of trust. And then over time, we've really seen how both sides build trust and understanding. And even if they would not necessarily agree to the other side, they would respect those other viewpoints And that is really the beginning to foster and enable further relationship building. So bringing different stakeholders together, bringing different approaches together. I think I'm very grateful and happy that this has worked out.
Well, as an extension of that, really, a second question, it's an invitation to comment, really, is that the CONPEACE project has to have impact. And could you say a bit about the way your work has been multiplied by the contributions of others in the team and others more generally to produce the wide impact that is needed?
Right. Well, with CONPEACE in particular, we've been working together with local universities, for example, with a university in Cúcuta at the border between Colombia and Venezuela. And they have used our methodology and hold events themselves. They're using the analytical tools, the framework, and basically have been replicating our methodology. But we've also had experiences both in the CONPEACE program as well as in the conflict platform, where various UN, United Nations agencies have integrated the conceptual and analytical tools. So that includes the training curriculum by the UN System Staff College to better understand non-state armed groups, to better understand those changes, but also the UN Refugee Agency, which is particularly important right now, also given the crisis in Venezuela that has led to a huge influx of migrants and refugees onto Colombian territory. So we've been collaborating with them to make sure that they have the analytical skill sets that we brought. And then, of course, also in academic terms, part of the framework that we've developed with the conflict platform has been integrated into undergraduate syllabus, where now students are using the frameworks to conduct their own studies. So it has been really working across the board, both in practice, to have the impact, to really build peace, and also to foster more research.
Since we have President Santos available and there is a question directed specifically at him, I'll now switch back to him for a moment, if I may. Daniel refers to President Santos's book, saying, your book notices the importance of normalizing relations with neighboring countries as an essential feature in bringing about the peace process. Can durable peace be advanced within a polarized continent? I think the question means such as we have at present.
Thank you. That's a very good question, which has a lot to do with what Annette just described, where she is making her research. Cúcuta is in the border between Venezuela and Colombia, and in an area that has all the components of every conflict that we have in Colombia: drug trafficking, criminal bands, the presence of a small guerrilla group called the ELN, the Venezuelan migrants that are coming to Colombia, and in a border of two countries that have absolutely no relations today. They don't recognize each other, they don't have any dialogue, so they cannot cooperate to try to, even in the pandemic, to try to improve the conditions of the border. So it's a typical case. But in today's world, any asymmetrical war like the war we had with the FARC needs the support of the neighbors. It's very, very difficult to have a successful peace process if of the neighbors in the region. For example, one of the difficulties today to have peace in Afghanistan is precisely because the countries that surround Afghanistan are not engaged in the peace process. Many of them even are not interested that there's peace in Afghanistan. So a necessary condition in today's world is that to resolve armed conflict, to resolve an asymmetrical war, the support of the region, of the neighbors, is very important. Very difficult to have peace because simply, and common sense tells you that any armed group, insurgency, will simply go to the other side of the border to protect themselves from any armed forces, and so the stimulus to have peace is very much reduced when there is bad relations between two countries and there's a peace process in one of those countries.
Thank you very much. Switching back to Annette, there are a couple of questions which are slightly pressing us as academics, and I think you might like to give a reaction to them. One is, you say that you had to work carefully to work out the specificities of the Colombian peace process. Are any two peace processes ever alike? And if not, what is the role of academics?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question, of course. Of course, no two peace processes are alike, but there are still very similar or commonalities that we can learn across the different cases. So the examples that I would like to give here is the way in which I've been working on peace process in Colombia, but also in Myanmar and partly also in Somalia. And for example, if we want to understand what it means for local communities to be immersed into those situations of peace processes, we really need to see what is the effect on the ground. And the example I gave before was the change from the open armed conflict, for example, to the ceasefire, or then to the demobilization of an armed actor. Now, in many cases, for people on the ground, once this change happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that they see the light at the end of the tunnel. It doesn't necessarily mean that they see what future actually brings and what peace means in that moment. What they see on the ground is a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty because suddenly the previous rules of behavior no longer apply. They suddenly don't have anymore the armed actor who, yes, is an armed actor, but who also provides certain regulations, gives, for example, guidance in terms of even conflict resolution, how to deal with disputes among neighbors, these everyday life issues that we might not see from the outside, but this is what people locally experience. Now, once this actor leaves, suddenly there is no longer this guidance. A ceasefire can mean a lot of uncertainty because you still don't know what the future will hold. So that then has an impact on the perceptions of security. It has an impact on ultimately on people's behavior, on their strategy, but it can also impact on the social fabric by not knowing what the future holds. So these are, for example, issues that happen across different peace processes, where it's therefore very important to have a narrative of what this peace means, but also to take into account what those local perspectives are and take them on board into the way that the peace process takes shape. And one example is the way that victims have been taken into account, for example, in the case of Colombia. But of course, there are many different aspects across different countries where those local perspectives about what the peace process means on the ground, rather than what it means behind the closed door of the negotiations, how this is relevant for ultimately achieving the goal of sustainable peace.
Can I add a small sentence to this answer to the question of, are conflicts similar or every conflict is different? What Annette says is quite right. There's no conflict which is exactly the same as others, but you can extract from many conflicts parts that will help to resolve another conflict. For example, in the case of Colombia, something extremely, extremely helpful was that since the very beginning, when I started thinking about the peace process, I went to some advisors that had hands-on experience in negotiations in different conflicts. One of them was the former Minister of Foreign Relations of Israel, who was the architect of the Camp David Agreement between Israel and Palestine. Another one was the commander of the guerrilla in Salvador, who was the chief negotiator in the Peace of Salvador. Another one was Jonathan Powell, Chief of Staff of Tony Blair, who was a negotiator with in the Northern Ireland Agreement. And they advised me permanently on their experience and how certain aspects of what happened there could be applicable and were applicable. I can give you many examples of the different things that happened in Northern Ireland or in Salvador or in the Camp David agreement that were very important in our agreement.
It's good for us academics to hear that we have some role in comparative work. The other slightly skeptical question for Annette goes as follows. It's from, well, there are two really that are linked. One is from Giulia Piccolino, who says, how can we avoid that the asymmetry in the data does not distort our understanding of conflicts? I think that that's really getting at the question of the objectivity of the scholar as opposed to the commitment of the activist. I think that's the question there. And the second related question, what difference does it make? This is from Brian Cheeverly. What difference does it make to a researcher being on the ground as much as you have been?
Okay, thanks. These are very important questions. On the data question, on the asymmetry, or I guess also on the distortion, I think here that the main point in that kind of research, the way we've been conducting it, is really triangulation. So that means triangulating different data sources. That means including, first of all, in qualitative work, when we do interviews, when we do participant observation, ethnographic methods, that we really make sure we talk to people with very different viewpoints. So different types of stakeholders. The way I've done this in my book Borderland Battles, for example, was to make sure I covered 10 different groups of people that range from very close to the state to very far away from the state. But then, of course, it also means using different data sources, such as media reports. In the quantitative analysis, we draw, for example, on the UCTP data, the Uppsala conflict data program, where we also have the quantitative element there. And then another dimension that we've been adding was the use of arts, as I explained before, to integrate local perceptions. So it's triangulation of different methods, approaches, and then of course also the triangulation of the different data sources within each of the approaches. And that doesn't make us perfectly impartial and objective, but it brings us as close as possible to that perspective. Now, following on the second question about what difference it makes to be on the ground, well, I think especially in topics and areas such as the ones that we've been studying, it's very important to see what the local impact on the ground is, but also to understand what it means to be immersed in such a situation. And some of the examples are the intangible security aspects. We tend to focus a lot in academia on body counts, on having statistics, on numbers, which are important. And it's important to know the number of people killed in a conflict. It's important to know the number of displacements, but it's also important to understand the perceived security, what fear does to a society, how fear, for example, erodes the social fabric, how the uncertainty that I mentioned changes people's behaviors. Being in that context doesn't mean that one feels the way that locals are, and we are privileged to be able to go in and out, of course, and we have to be very careful and ethically responsible with the way in which we're doing that kind of research. But it does bring us closer to the human part of this kind of research and understanding the human suffering on the ground, which is so relevant in that kind of research.
Yes, you mentioned the ethics, and I am aware, because you've been doing this for 10 years, of the ever mounting University of Oxford concern about the ethics training for researchers. And no doubt both you yourself and also the other people in your team must be at the extreme limits of what the University Ethics Committee worries about, in terms both of the integrity of the information that you collect and the duties that you owe to your informants, and also the protection of your own safety. You've been doing this for 10 years, and not everybody would be aware of quite how many really difficult and dangerous places you have therefore made the effort to go to and to live in. The question that comes from, I think, Sergio Garcia is, how could existing governments help protecting researchers in conflict zones while they are doing their field work?
Well, that's an important question. I think the main point here really is how it's possible to make that kind of research considering the many different interests that not just governments have, but also other stakeholders on the ground have. And one part, of course, is the official guidelines, the official regulations by Oxford University and, of course, also other universities. But of course, it's also the personal responsibility vis-a-vis people on the ground and vis-a-vis those who are affected by those conflict situations. Now, with governments, I mean, there are very different approaches depending to the case in which one does that kind of research. But I do think that in general, it's very important for governments to understand that this work is of academic value, that this is important to understand the dynamics on the ground. And therefore, it's important to grant certain access to those areas. But of course, with the responsibility that we as researchers have to not do any harm and to not create any side effects that are not intended.
I wonder whether President Santos has any thoughts on these questions before we go on.
And I prefer the title of professor than of president, because that's been my dream all my life, and I'm very honored to be a visiting professor at Oxford. The security of researchers, that's a very important question. And it depends on the attitude of, for example, the armed forces or the armed groups to how they are conducting the war. If you are conducting a very dirty war and not respecting human rights, you start thinking about the consequences after you have a peace agreement, and so you want to hide where researchers are not welcomed, and their work will be very difficult. On the contrary, if you want to show what you are doing and that you're genuinely seeking peace, and you want to have the elements of the conflict in order to be able to build peace afterwards, in that case, researchers will be very much welcome. So that depends very much on the attitude of governments, of the security forces, or even of the armed groups. Many armed groups are very interested in researchers to come and show the atrocities of the other side, or the realities of what they were living, or that they're living, and what they want to fix. So it's a difficult issue. It's the same as journalists that go to cover war, and many times, as you all know, war is the first victim. The truth is the first victim of war, and so that researchers have to be especially careful on the evidence that they recollect to then teach about their findings.
So I think we're getting to the end of the questions time, but most people may not, listening to this, would probably want some thought about the very current situation. There are two aspects that could affect what we've been talking about. The first is the impact of the COVID crisis, which has obviously had a profound effect in Colombia, and also in the relationship between Colombia and Venezuela, and that in many ways is a very difficult, problematic situation to handle, but could perhaps have some dampening effects, or some effects in opening up new opportunities for peacemaking as well. So that's one question. And the second question, which I have to ask on my own behalf, nobody else is asking it, but does it make a difference who wins the presidential election in the United States from the point of view of the future of the Colombian peace process? I'd really welcome responses from both of you on both those points. Perhaps you'd like to go first, President Santos.
Okay, I'll go first. In the pandemic, one would have thought that it would help. And even the Secretary General of the United Nations made a call for every armed conflict to have a ceasefire. But not many people heard it and didn't follow through. In the case of Colombia, they didn't. And organized crime has been disrupted in their businesses, but they are taking advantage of the situation to reaccommodate and many times to increase their business and their power. So I would say that the first impression would be, oh, the pandemic might help to decrease conflict and to stimulate, because what one would imagine is the pandemic is an enemy of everybody. Let's make a ceasefire and work together to fight the pandemic. But unfortunately, that has not happened. And it's been, I must say, a bit on the contrary. And to your second question, the answer is yes. There is a very clear difference between the attitude of the Trump administration and the attitude of the Democrats and what Obama and Biden had with the peace process. Much more supportive, much more willing to go along. As a matter of fact, the United States had a special envoy in the peace process that was named by Obama and by Biden. So there is a big difference of who is going to win the elections and the repercussion on the peace building process in Colombia.
Annette, would you like to have the last word?
Yes, maybe I can just add to that. I mean, I agree with Professor Santos, of course, on the points that there are strong differences, great differences between the two administrations, are likely that we are going to see. But I would also think that in general, that the United States will probably focus a lot on domestic issues also in both sides. I would like to more expand on the pandemic question, which I think is very important, of course, given the current circumstances. And what we've seen is what Professor Santos also mentioned about how armed groups are taking advantage of the situation. There was for time period the ceasefire offered by the ELN, but the results are questionable. But what we've seen are also other side effects in terms of how those armed groups take advantage in imposing rules themselves, imposing what they call public health rules, such as curfews. They tell people when to stay at home, which again, from the local perspective, might work to some extent. But again, of course, this is against any sort of democratic or human rights compliance. Also, another impact that we've seen, especially at the border, that I'd like to highlight, because that is where we see the double crisis of both the impact from Venezuela and the continued insecurity in Colombia, is that the border closures had a huge unintended effect. We've seen border closures across the globe to stop the pandemic, but it also means that in contexts where people still have to cross the border, such as Venezuelans coming back to Colombia, they were forced to use informal trails that were controlled or are controlled by criminal groups, by armed groups. And therefore we saw more abuse against women, in particular sexual abuse also at those trails. And it was really a limbo situation of people on the ground, of not being able to move back and forth. So it's important when these measures are taken to really think through what this means locally. And then the final point there is also coming back to the starting point of how we can build peace after the conflict, is that, of course, it requires state presence. It requires reaching out to those communities that have suffered from the conflict. And in many cases, because things had to stop, because people were not able to do their work, that also had a side effect for those communities who again felt left alone because the presence was no longer as strong as it was before. So this is a very important aspect where right now it's important to show those communities that there is presence, that they're not on their own, that they're not abandoned, and that even in the pandemic, everyone in those countries is valued in the same way.
So perhaps the takeaway at the end of this is that although CONPEACE has already done some magnificent work, and your team has had great both academic outputs and also real policy influence, it's halfway there. There's a great deal more that still needs to be done. The situation is changing. Peace has not been built. And the kind of research which President Santos was saying is so necessary continues to be urgent. And it continues to be very important that your project, which has got this track record and has got this established record of achievement, is reinforced and continued. That's perhaps a slightly partisan point from myself, but I think we do, that follows logically from what has been said. And finally, then, we are all extremely proud of you, Annette, and of the team. But this is a very competitive award that you've secured, and I think you've demonstrated in this webinar how you thoroughly merit the recognition that you have received. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.